We're now going to look at the mechanics of Rule 609. We'll be focusing on Rule 609A, which contains the core of the rule. Rule 609A is split into two parts. Each part gives a separate alternative avenue for introducing a prior conviction. Rule 609A1 has two requirements. First, the crime must have been punishable by more than 1 year. This equates to a felony in the federal system and in most state systems as well. The second requirement is that the conviction must pass a balancing test. There are different balancing tests depending on who the witness is. For the criminal defendant, there is a special balancing test. This balancing test is geared in favor of exclusion. The evidence will be excluded unless the probative value outweighs the prejudice. This is a modified reverse 403. We give the criminal defendant this special balancing test because of the concern about how much prejudice a criminal defendant suffers when the jury learns of his prior convictions. For all other witnesses, we use normal 403 balancing. Okay, so the 403 balancing is geared in favor of admission to exclude a prior conviction for impeachment purposes. The probative value must be substantially outweighed by the risk of prejudice. The other alternative route through which you can bring in a prior conviction is Rule 609A2. This rule has only one requirement. That requirement is that the elements of the prior crime must have required proving a dishonest act or false statement. The thinking here is that crimes involving dishonesty or false statement are far more probative of credibility and thus are far more useful for impeachment purposes. The rule contains no balancing. A prior conviction that falls within 609A2 is automatically admissible, and the judge may not engage in any balancing. So the first step for the impeaching lawyer is to choose whether to use Rule 609A1 or 609A2. The impeaching lawyer always prefers 609A2 because the judge has no discretion to exclude. So we're going to start there. Typically, I think it's helpful to start with 609A2. It's a simple rule. If you meet the requirements, the prior conviction is automatically admissible. So start with 609A2. If your conviction does not fall within 609A2, then move to 609A1, which is a much more complicated analysis. Okay, so looking at 609A2, a couple things to note. First, the rule applies to felonies and misdemeanors. In other words, when you're determining whether 609A2 applies, it does not matter whether the prior conviction was for a felony or a misdemeanor. What does matter is that the prior conviction was for a crime involving dishonesty or false statement. There is a narrow, tightly limited list of crimes that qualify. I've included the list on the slide: perjury, false statement, criminal fraud, embezzlement, false pretenses, bribery, counterfeiting, passing bad checks, and forgery. You must know this list. Crimes that are not on the list will not fall within 609A2 unless they are very, very close cousins. Please also note about the list that standard theft crimes do not count for 609A2. There are several theft crimes on the list, such as embezzlement or false pretenses, but generic theft crimes will not qualify under Rule 609A2. You have to bring those in under 609A1. All right, let's look at 609A1. Again, there are two requirements. First, you must show that the prior crime was a felony. And second, you have to pass a balancing test. The criminal defendant, recall, gets the special balancing test, which favors exclusion. All other witnesses get 403 balancing, which favors admission. Now, in doing the balancing, courts use a number of factors. These factors are all part of the balancing, but there are standard factors that must be considered when analyzing whether a prior conviction should be admitted under Rule 609A1. Okay, the first of those factors is the impeachment value of the former crime. What we're looking for here is how much the former crime tells us about whether the witness is honest or dishonest. So a crime that relates to truth-telling has more probative value and is more likely to be admitted. The second aspect that the court will look at is the timing of the prior conviction. A prior conviction that is recent will have more probative value. Also, courts consider whether there is a pattern of criminality. Is there more than one prior conviction? If there is, that increases the probative value too. The third factor that courts routinely consider is how central the issue of credibility is. What we're looking for here is whether the witness's credibility is important. If it is, the proponent has a greater need to impeach, and this increases the probative value of the evidence. Fourth, the courts look at the similarity between the prior crime and the charged crime. This factor goes to prejudice. The more similarity there is, the more prejudice there is, because it is more likely that the jury will use the evidence as proof of propensity. Remember, under Rule 609, the only legitimate purpose for offering the evidence is to show the jury that the witness is not credible, that the witness is prone to lie. The problem, of course, is that the jury will also likely use prior convictions, especially when the witness is the defendant. The jury will likely use the prior convictions to think this person is prone to commit crimes and therefore more likely committed this crime. When the prior conviction is similar to the crime charged, there is an enhanced likelihood that the jury will engage in he did it before, he did it again, and that is not permitted under Rule 609. Many students use the similarity factor as on the probative value side, but that is incorrect. Similarity goes to prejudice because the jury is more likely to engage in the propensity inference. The next factor is the importance of getting the defendant's own testimony. The concern here is that the defendant may choose not to testify because he's concerned that the jury will learn of his prior convictions and convict him on the basis of his past transgressions. The risk that the defendant will forego testifying creates prejudice, and that's going to be greater when his testimony is especially important in his case. Now, how do these factors fit into the overall balance? Let's look at our standard chart for our balancing rule. But before we do that, please note that I think the most important factors here in our list are first the impeachment value of the former crime, and second the similarity between the prior crime and the charged one. All right, now let's go to our standard balancing. On the probative value side, you'll see the impeachment value goes to strength. The timing of the prior conviction and the prior pattern of criminality also go to strength. For reliability of the evidence, that's a given because we have a prior conviction. Need, you'll see the importance of the proposition it helps to prove. The more important credibility is, the more important the impeachment is, and the greater the need is. On the unfair prejudice side of the balance, the source of the prejudice, especially when the criminal defendant is the witness, is always going to be the same. The risk that the jury will use the evidence for its improper purpose as proof that the defendant is prone to commit crimes or is a bad man who ought to be in prison regardless. When the prior crime is very similar to the charged crime, this problem is even greater. The risk of prejudice is higher. So you see the similarity factor on the unfair prejudice side of the balance. And then in terms of the impact on the case, you'll see the importance of getting the defendant's own testimony factor there as well. For all other witnesses, you use standard 403. Most of the Rule 609 factors are still relevant in using 403 for some kind of witness other than the criminal defendant. You'll see them on the slide here. Impeachment value goes to strength, timing and pattern of criminality go to strength, the central nature of the credibility issue goes towards need. On the unfair prejudice side, if the witness is a party, the similarity of the prior crime will increase prejudice. If the witness is not a party and not related to a party, then that will have less of an impact on the case. Finally, I want to say a couple of things about Rule 609B, which governs convictions over 10 years old. Rule 609B imposes a stricter standard for convictions that are over 10 years old. The concern is that these convictions no longer show us much about a witness's credibility, and so they are much harder to admit. The key issue is how to measure the length of, how to measure the age of the conviction. Do we do it from the date of conviction or from the date that the defendant was released? Rule 609B tells us that we measure from the date of conviction or the date of release, whichever is later. If the defendant or if the witness served any time for the crime, then we use the date of release. You would only use the date of conviction if the defendant served no time or was sentenced to time served. When 609B does apply, the rule requires that the proponent give reasonable written notice of its intent to use the conviction, and then it imposes a strict reverse 403 standard. In order to use the conviction, the proponent must convince the judge that the probative value of the crime, supported by specific facts and circumstances, substantially outweighs prejudice. Evidence is usually excluded under Rule 609B, and please note that this applies to all witnesses and all types of prior crimes. So even a crime that would normally qualify under 609A2, say a prior conviction for perjury, will be treated under Rule 609B if it is more than 10 years old. All right, that concludes our discussion of the mechanics of Rule 609B. Please take the short quiz on TWEN, and I will see you in class.